All right. So our St. Bakita prayer for human trafficking survivors. On February 8th, which is St. Bakita's Day, the global Catholic community commemorates the feast of St. Josephine Bakita, patron saint of survivors of human trafficking, by joining together in prayer and awareness against human trafficking. We encourage you to join a prayer service any day and have this day mean something of solidarity with people around the world who are impacted by the evils of human trafficking and are working to eradicate this form of modern day slavery. It is really important to be able to pray for those who have been impacted by human trafficking, the victims that are still out there, the survivors who have made it out but are still struggling to heal. It is important to pray for the traffickers, for the Johns that buy our victims, to pray that they will see a way out, know that this is wrong, and have the courage to reach out to help, to get help. We also want to pray for those people in this movement, law enforcement, judges, social service agencies, churches, anybody that is out there that is reaching out and assisting human trafficking victims in the many ways that we need it. We just ask that we pray for all of those support staff as well, because this is a really evil subject, one that is the second leading crime in the world, in the United States. And we need lots of prayers to be able to finally eradicate this. In God's name, we ask this. Amen. Great. Well, I want to thank my dear friend, John Michael Landers, for being here with us. I have only known John Michael for maybe not even 6 months, but his story, his path, his journey has so impressed me. And we so rarely get to hear from a male survivor. And I just thought that this would be an amazing blessing to bring to the U.S. Catholic Sisters Book Club, to share with everyone how that this can happen with athletes, with males. And it's just an important message for all of us to hear. So thank you, John Michael, for joining us. I hope that everybody got a chance to read your book or books. I actually read both of them. I was really, really, I'm not going to say, you say, I loved it, I enjoyed it. It's always hard. I found it very enlightening. It opened up my eyes to a lot of things, but then I wanted more. And so I was glad that there was the second book, because that answered a lot of questions for me. And I think my perspective is a little different than maybe others for 2 reasons. One, because I am a survivor of human trafficking as well as a teenager, but also because I live in Columbus, Ohio. And John Michael lives very close, an hour away. And some of his trafficking happened in my city. And so it added a different nuance for me as well, looking places like, oh my God, just it really, a lot came out of that for me personally. So thank you for having the bravery to do this, to write it. I know how hard it is to write your story, but it was worth it. I mean, it's something that like I said, we need to talk more about. And John Michael also was a attendee of our first ever male survivor retreat that the U.S. Catholic Sisters and I put on in December. And we were able to pour just lots and lots of love into him and help healing journey during that time. So I'm just going to leave it up to you, John Michael, and kind of talk with everybody. People can leave us a message in the Q&A, and I will read those. And for the ones we find, appropriate, we will ask John Michael those. So
great. I appreciate it. And thank you so much, Teresa, for giving me a platform to share my story and talk about it. It is something that I really feel passionate about, and I want people to hear, and I really like people to ask questions and talk. So I really encourage people who are listening right now, please ask questions. There isn't anything I won't try to answer. And I think because the more we answer, the more we talk about it, the more we're aware of it. And that's really kind of what it's about. So I just want to share that when I wrote this book, I was still struggling with even dealing with what this all meant because I had no idea. So I decided to write it as a fiction because I wasn't ready to share this as being me. I could talk about it as objective over here as David. So that helped a lot. And I also wanted to show in this first book what it was like to be a teenager dealing with all this heaviness, but yet trying to cover it up and hide it and keep it quiet. And so that's why I think when you go through the book, there's not a lot of glaring abuse events happening. It's more about what's going on in David's head and why he was going through what he was going and what was he doing, what was he thinking. I didn't know what words were like abuse. I didn't know what that meant at that time. I didn't know what trafficking was at all. I don't even think the word was even invented back then. And of course, I grew up with the fact that boys cannot be sexually abused. So I had that completely in my head. So what I was trying to deal with when everything was happening was, what does all this mean? And what does this mean for me now? It wasn't my fault because everybody told me it was, that I caused it to happen. And as the stories go on, and like you said, the second book, you start to really put the pieces together as David is doing it as well. The fact that this was a trafficking issue, because when I was going through it, I had no idea. And I wanted to be an Olympian. And so I thought this was a part of what to become an elite athlete. So I just accepted it. This is all a part of it. And I had people like my mother constantly telling me and gaslighting me that this is what you have to do. You have to do your part. So with that being said, the other thing I have not shared very much with anybody is when I went in and decided the names for the family, the Matthew family, they're all biblical names. And they all represent something about those stories. David, of course, David and Goliath. And then you had Cain, the first son born. And of course, then as we see, we find out that he loses one of his best friends. And that's kind of like the whole Cain and Abel issue. Then you have Magdalene, who was my little sister, who was Mary Magdalene. And my parents thought that she was going to be the next person to bring Jesus back onto the earth. So there was this whole crazy thing going on. Of course, then Caleb, my father, is the one who believed that God was everything and kind of overlooked the human aspect of things. That he got so involved with what was right that he missed some of the empathy and the humanness. And then Lydia is a very interesting story. And she's that person who was the businesswoman, very forward about money and how to get money and doing like this. And although she believed in God and all this stuff, she still wanted to make sure she got everything for her and her family. So that's where all those came out of, and that was kind of neat. And very few people ever connect those together. So I just wanted to share that with you. I'm trying to think, where can I start? Where would you like me to share? Where?
Um, there was a couple things that you just said that really resonated with me. One was the hiding it. And it resonates with me because that was the same way for myself being a survivor in high school. And it's almost like you have two lives. You have a double life that you're living.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. And I think that's a survival method.
Mhm.
And I think that's something that a survivors having connected in a way. It's kind of like our family, our brothers and sisters of survivors have that experience. And it was a very different. I called myself, let's see, that I divided myself up into categories. There was the good son, there was the student, there was the diver, there was the sinner, because I called myself a sinner whenever the trafficking would happen. And I was always trying to balance these things out so that I could go to school and act like nothing's wrong. And it's just crazy to think that coming from a farm town where we are not told all this stuff and just experiencing it and then being thrust on the public stage as a diver as I was and representing the United States was a whole nother dynamic that I wasn't quite sure I was ready for.
Mm.
And to be so young, and I remember that when I did qualify for the team, they were kind of trying to remove me because it was my first time. I was 16. I had not won a state title. I had not even gone to the nationals. That was my first nationals. And I had knocked out a guy who had already gone to the World Games the year before. And so they were trying to move him up. And so there was all this like I don't want to say hate, but there's this a lot
Oh,
of questions on what I was going to do.
yeah.
But it's just that whole hiding thing that is really interesting and trying to understand what was going on, what did it mean, who can I talk to, who can I trust? Because once the trafficking started and I was introduced to the professionals who were helping me, I was introduced to judges, police officers, therapists, nurses, doctors, lawyers. All these people are a part of this group that was based in Columbus. And so I started this whole thing that I can't trust anyone. And it became a really big issue that I didn't know who to turn to. And of course, I had to make a deal that I was not allowed to talk about it or share with anybody anything that was happening. And we had talked before we started tonight that I wanted someone to hear it. I wanted someone to know. And I knew I couldn't tell anybody, but if I could do an indicator or get someone to ask me, then I was allowed to tell somebody and allowed to share with them. And in the book, as you see, I finally do try to tell my mother. And then, of course, it turned out to be pretty bad, where she slapped me and said that I must have made it up. And it must have been my fault if anything really happened. So that's what was going along in that. And I think that, again, our teenage minds are not developed yet. And here we are trying to understand. I mean, my first experience with any type of sex was with a 60-year-old man in a Hotel 6, and I'm like, what does that mean? What does that mean about me? Um, and I remember, how you just kind of create things as we go along. And as survivors, I think we try to comprehend and try to understand why the events happen. So we start making up lies and stories just so that we can understand it and get through it. Like, I must not be worth enough, or I'm not good enough, or why would this happen to me? That kind of thing. So I must just created this because that's what we're told. And so we create this false self about ourselves, and the whole time our real self is battling with the false self. And it's like that whole story with wrestling with God. It's one of the things that I kind of look at it the whole time. I was wrestling with myself, trying to find out who's real and who's not. How do I survive? How do I get to the next day? And then adding on to that, the pressures of being an elite athlete and going and representing your country and dealing with this reporters and all this stuff in our faces, it's really overwhelming for a teenager. And we see that happen with our US gymnastics team, especially the women. And if we go back and we watch the last Olympics with Simone Biles and her issues with the twisties, as they called them, here was a young woman. We forget that she still was a young woman. She's barely in her 20s then, and that's still a child to me in a way. And she knew she had to stay on that Olympic team to keep the story going, or they would have forgotten about it. And that was the only reason she went. And she did immaculate anyway, so it was incredible. So that's a long answer for that, but it's kind of like a lot of things are coming in nuances, but and I know that you understand how it is, and we could probably compare how we devised our hiding and how we created it and what we thought was working, and we thought we were doing such a great job, and I don't think we necessarily were. And
Well,
that's one of the things.
in it, because there were signs, right? Like you said, there were indicators, but nobody like helped us. Like nobody, like we were the ones to be expected to say something, and we weren't going to, because so much was on the line.
Right. Right. And I'm going to just be passing this back and forth with you as well. And I'm sure you understand this. People look at us and say, well, why didn't you fight back? Why didn't you say no? Why didn't you do all this? They have not understood the fact that we are completely groomed before this point actually happened. And in my case, my mother was groomed before me. And later on, I found out that my whole team, the organization, was groomed before my mother was groomed by these people, so that they could get access to who they wanted. And it was all calculated. But we try to understand all that stuff, and then we try to find these indicators so that we can speak, because not only were we told not to talk about it, we were threatened. Horrible things were going to happen. I mean, one of the things that I was told is that my dog would be killed. I know, a teenager, That's huge, you know, don't kill my dog, So that's kind of a things like that. And it's not like so subtle as I think a lot of people try to make it out to be. It is gradual and it takes a few times. My experience was nothing like I think yours was. Mine was an organized situation with professional men who were making six figures or above, and they were all protecting each other. Like I said, lawyers, doctors, police officers, judges, all of them were taking care of each other. If something came up, they all came and swarmed in, so nobody knew about it. They called it the secret society. And so we were told slowly that these things were going to happen. Of course, the first thing they told us were the great things. If you come with us, we're going to give you all this incredible stuff, and you're going to be able to do this, and you'll be able to do that. And in my case, I was told by the lawyer who started this whole thing up that all my family members would get free medicine and doctor's appointments and eye exams, operations. My sister had a horrible sled accident, and her whole plastic surgery was taken care of as long as I continued to have these dinners. And I think people don't, it took me a long time to consider it as being trafficking because I didn't know what it was. And I was still able to go home to my house, and I was sleeping in my bed. There was never a question of being a runaway or, homeless or any of that stuff. I wasn't addicted to drugs, and it was just didn't make sense. This was something that I was told was part of the Olympic dream.
Mm.
And then they slowly start telling me that if you don't do this will happen. A, B, or C, your parents will have to pay everything back, and they will come in and take all the kids away, and they'll lose their house, and your dad will go to jail because he can't pay it back, that kind of thing. And so it's a lot on a teenager's mind.
Right, exactly. And I'll have to be honest with you. When you had applied to come to the retreat, I knew that you were an Olympic athlete, and I knew that you had been sexually exploited, assaulted, molested. I mean, any of those would qualify. But I'm like, but is it trafficking? And
Right.
right. And so because that's a little different. And then as soon as I started reading your book, I was like, yes, it is. Like it just answered it right for me, because there was the manipulation, there was the threats, right? If you don't do this, we will do that. There was also the financial aspect of it, where your family reaped financially for the pain that you went through. So there, I mean, it was very clearly, this is human trafficking.
And it was interesting because when my mother was groomed, her whole part of the business that they got her to do was to make sure that I was at the right place at the right time, dressed appropriately for the event that was coming up, and because if I didn't show up, then it would all be over. It would be ruined. And so there was threat on her side too, because they groomed her, and then they started telling her, if he doesn't do this, we're going to do this to you, and da 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 da. And so there's always this fear, and there was always the fear of, if I didn't follow through, I would be killed. And that was the last thing I remember the lawyer telling me, that, I can't help you if you don't follow through. And in the one scene where I'm with the doctor at the motel and he starts to hand me an envelope, I literally thought it was a gun. He went to go get the gun out and he was going to shoot me, and it was done. And there was a weird moment there because I felt, oh, this is great because this is over. If I die now, then I don't have to worry about it anymore. I'm done. And then when he turned around with the envelope, there was this like almost a disappointment feeling in a weird way. I don't know if you've ever experienced that, where you're like, oh no, this is going to continue. And of course, when I look in the envelope and find out that there's this money that I'm not allowed to tell my mother about, another secret,
Right.
I was like, I can't get out of here. And there were ways that I worked on it. And there was ways that when I got older, when I got to be about 17, because this went on throughout my whole high school years, I started figuring out to turn it. So if I was in the event, or I call them the events, our date, or whatever you want to call, if I would turn it and look like I was coming on to the John, then things got a little bit nervous. Then I had one or two things were going to happen. It was going to be over really quickly, or it's going to get abusive.
Mm.
And I always thought, I'm going to take the chance because How much more can I be abused? And if I started telling them how I liked them and I thought they were attractive, they got nervous because they had children my age.
Mm.
And it started to make them feel, wait a minute, this isn't right. And a lot of times the date was over. And they were too embarrassed to say anything to the rest of the group, you know. But then there were many times that it became very violent where they would pin you down and they would just,
Yeah.
yeah. And another thing I figured out that if this is going to be a little graphic and I apologize, if I could get them to climax first and I didn't, it was not sex. I equated that I'm not having sex with this person, and it would end the situation quicker. They got what they wanted. This is over. They're going to drive me home.
Right.
Because the first time I found myself finding my own way home many times,
Mm.
you know.
Hmm. Wow. And then just the layers and layers of shame that people don't realize that we go through. Like you mentioned about, you climaxing, then that's another level of shame that like, oh, I shouldn't enjoy this. This is something that's wrong. And that the sins that, goes through our minds as well. So,
I think you're absolutely right. And I think we never talk about that. Very few people ever, and you're one of the first people I've ever heard say, hey, there was moments of pleasure,
mhm,
within it. I mean, my body responded, my body reacted. They're touching me. And that was what was confusing as well. Because before that, I was, considered that I was engaged in kindergarten with a girl down the street, and I wanted to go to the dances to be, and nobody would date me because I was this athlete and I was in this farm town and they didn't understand that whole thing. So that created a lot of things. But I think a lot of the times I was so shamed that nobody could ever really get close to me. I was always blocked off. One of the nicknames they gave me was the Ice Prince. I mean, I would smile and try to be nice to everybody, but I was cold as ice because I didn't know how to feel.
mhm.
I didn't know. I lost connection of who I was,
I mean, you do
and
that as a survival mechanism.
yes, and I think that's the thing that people don't seem to understand a lot too. And I don't think they understand that once an abuse happens, even if it reoccurs, there is a moment where my body froze many times. And I don't know if it was like, oh my God, I did it again. Am I in this situation again? Or what it was, but I couldn't move. And then I would thought, just lay here and it'll be over. Just get over it. And there are times when I felt like I was like looking down on what was happening
Mhm.
from an angle. And that was kind of crazy.
Yeah, that's a out of body reaction that
Right.
right of
I have a question for you
yeah.
because I've wanted to ask you this since I've all read all your stuff because I want to compare it to my story. Did you ever feel that God left you alone?
No, I didn't. I get that question a lot too.
Yeah,
I never did. I never blamed him for this happening. I still prayed really heavy, like, please God, like get me out of this. I don't know how to get out of it. I remember coming home and 3, 4 in the morning when they would bring me back, and I would sneak back inside and take a hot bath. I don't know how my parents could sleep through not hearing the bathtub running all those times, but I would take a hot bath, and I think instinctually I did it, one, to wash away all of that, right? If what do you call it? Physically and there's a word, I can't think of the word, but just, and so, but then also I used that time to cry because the water was running, and I reached out to the angels and I would say, please surround me and heal me. I don't want to get pregnant. Please be there. So that I used that time actually to really reach out. And I think maybe John Michael, instinctively, I knew in my soul that if I let God go, then everything was gone. And I
yeah,
had no reason to live anymore. Like they had everything, right? They had my body, they had my brain, they had everything, but they couldn't have that. Did I know
right.
as I was a 15-year-old? No, I don't.
No,
But
no.
now looking back, I think that's, yeah.
Well, there's a really kind of a symbolic thing there too, is baptizing yourself,
Yes. Well,
washing away the sins. And I mean, yes, I understand that too. I did the same thing. I did go through a point where I thought that he had left me.
Mm,
And I thought, what did I do wrong? And why is this happening? But I also remember that every time the events were happening, I felt this other spirit or this other person holding me while it was happening. And I can remember it's kind of like, that experience I had at the retreat, sitting on the bed talking to my younger self. But it was like I felt this person holding me, and I can remember one time just looking up and saying, why can't we stop this? Why do we have to go through this? I never felt alone in that sense. So that whole thing that you're never alone, I don't think I ever felt alone, because even when the worst of it all was happening, I didn't feel like I was alone.
mhm,
Like in the second book, you'll find out that, what happens at the university was really one of those moments that really tried me, because I didn't understand. I went through 4 years of being abused by all these professionals. Then it just took one grad student and I fell apart.
mhm.
And I think that's what happens a lot of times.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
and I think the other thing that's really crazy in my situation is when we're going through this traumatic moments, the coach became my savior in a way, and yet my coach was also one of the abusers.
Right.
But I created this thing. A lot of people could say that it's Stockholm syndrome or whatever it is, but I was not. That was the one person I trusted and believed, even though all this other stuff happened with him. I thought I was in love with him.
Right.
I thought he was going to take me away and this was all going to work. And of course it wasn't, because by that time, my dream of being with a family was gone, because my father was constantly, which made me think that my father knew, would tell me that, you're an abomination. He would use Bible verses constantly to tell me that, if you lie with a man, then you're nothing more than a this and that. Da, 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 da. And I didn't understand where that was coming from, because my dad was sneaking into my bed at nights too.
Mm.
And so I didn't understand what all of it meant, and why me, out of all of us kids in this family, I was chosen. I don't know, but
Do
I
you
do
think,
see that.
I'm sure that you get this question a lot. Do you think that if you wouldn't have been an athlete, this wouldn't have happened?
I thought about that many times.
Uh-huh.
I thought about that, and I also thought about, if I wasn't an athlete, if this didn't happen, what would my orientation be?
Yeah, because
Would I be married?
that's the one part of your book that really that hit me hard, was when you had said somebody had asked you, when did you know you were gay? And you said, I never got to make that choice. That really hit me hard. Oh,
Yeah, I still to this day get. I watch. I have nieces and nephews who are experiencing love for the first time, and I feel jealous in a way about that, because I never got that. I never got to find out, did I want to kiss the girl or the guy, because I started seeing people as people, and I always have since I was a kid. I never saw male female. I don't know why. And I think that's one of the things that maybe people picked up on, because I just saw a person, and if they were cool, I wanted to be with that person. It didn't matter what gender they were. And I still feel to this day, I wonder what would have happened. And I did an article on gender identity and sexual orientation after childhood sexual abuse with men. And I interviewed like 6 people. And it was funny that I took quotes from them and everything. And then I was reading in the back, and I realized that 5 of the 6 were straight men who are married now,
mm,
and how they struggled with trying to deal with what their sexual orientation was. Was it going to create them to be gay, which was their biggest fear?
right.
And I think at one point, I just thought that this is what I have to be. So that's what I am. So I shut everything else down.
Right. It is one of the parts that we talked about this at the retreat, that we need to do more talking and about in our circles, is the sexual identity. We see it with the females as well, where then maybe they don't want to have a relationship with a man, and so then become gay. Or we've had people in our retreats that are bisexual, and I think that it does make us very confused. How would it not? Especially when we are teenagers and this is how we were introduced. Like people, if I'm in a circle of people, and everyone's joking around about, oh, how old were you when you lost your virginity? That's a common thing people, talk about and everything. And I'm like, excuse me, I need to go to the bathroom because I don't want
Right,
to be
right,
in this conversation because I didn't have a choice. And
right.
so it's a little different for us those kinds of things. So yeah. So Jean has a question and
Sure.
please feel free, everybody, to write some questions down here and I will ask John Michael. Jean says, what advice would you give a young boy such as David to do if his parents didn't believe him and if they say he needs to go along with it, just like your mom did?
That's a great
Yeah.
question, Gene. Thank you. There's several things that I would suggest, and if the mother trust is not there, then just try to find another adult that you do trust. It could be a neighbor, it could be a teacher, it could be anything. And yet, if that child feels like he cannot or she cannot come right out and share the story or tell because they've already promised that they're not allowed to tell,
Mhm.
they will usually give you indicators. And I truly believe every child wants to be heard. And it's a matter of parents just taking the time to really look and watch the body language. It's going to come out in body language situations. Some indicators that I did, I was one of these kids who was impeccably dressed all the time. I could not have dirt anywhere on me. If I did, I wouldn't change. And after a while, I just wore the same clothes for the whole week.
Ah.
And I thought they've got to figure this out. They got to know. And my parents never said anything. The school, the teachers never said anything. And everybody just went, "Oh, I guess he's just rebelling. He's a kid, he's rebelling." Another thing is, of course, I would take 3 or 4 showers a day. And I tried, well, I'm not going to shower at all. That was the other thing that I tried after the clothes didn't work. And my mother just said, "Oh, he's in the pool 2 or 3 times a day, so he doesn't need a shower." So there were always these excuses that were coming from my parents. And then the final thing that I tried that I was so frustrated is I just would scream at the top of my lungs, or I would say the F bomb.
Mm.
And I was one of those kids that if I cussed, everyone laughed because it just didn't fit him. And no one, even at school, no one asked.
Mm.
And I never understood why. But that's one of the things. And I do think the parents, even speaking to my mother last week, and she said she knew instinctively, she knew she had this feeling in her gut, but she was ashamed to ask because she allowed it to happen and she actually promoted it. She basically handed me over to them. And then there was the point of what is the neighbors going to think? She was more worried about what everybody else is going to think and talk about her, that she wanted to keep it quiet.
That's
So I would say that I do believe that every kid wants to be heard. Even if it's uncomfortable, they want to know, is it the right thing?
Yeah, when I talk to schools, to kids, and I will be going to 3 schools, middle and high schools in the next 2 days. I always tell them to find somebody, like to stop right now and think of one person in their life that they could tell anything to. And it could be a teacher, it could be an aunt, it could be a grandma, a neighbor. I mean, your Boy Scout coach or leader, but try and identify that person now before something happens to you, because it's not always the parents.
And in my book, if you realize it, it ends up being my brother.
Yeah,
He is the
love.
one that starts coming around and starts, and then I reread that chapter where he basically breaks down and says, "I'm sorry, I didn't protect you.
Yeah.
I should have beat the crap out of them," and da 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 da. But he had no idea what he thought
It
that it was
sounds like
just
he was very confused too. Like, why is my brother going to all these dinners and he's coming back dinner different?
right,
Like
right.
knew instinctively he knew something too. And
But then he also says he was afraid to find out because he didn't know what to do with it,
yeah,
and he was only like 3 years older than I was. So he was a child himself. And I think, unfortunately, his best friend's character, which is really true, when he was killed, that was what brought us together,
yeah,
and we were able to connect in a way we never were before. And
yeah,
I think that was kind of crazy in a
yeah.
way. But I do think children want to be heard and they want to be believed is the other thing, because there is a big thing about telling somebody and knowing that you're not going to be believed.
Mm-hmm.
Because why even tell?
Yeah. Yeah, we see that a lot in even like when the Me Too movement came on, how many people, women and men, that said, "Oh, yeah, I was raped and I tried to tell somebody and they didn't believe me." And then you just stop telling, people. So
Exactly. And if you look at Brendan Fraser and you talk to read his story, I don't know if anyone knows this,
oh,
he was abused and he
oh,
said something and then he was blacklisted for 10 years out of Hollywood. He
oh.
could not get a job. And then finally he comes back, he does The Whale and he wins an Academy Award, which is unbelievable.
Yeah, I just
And,
watched it
I'm
last
so
week actually.
and I'm so glad that our book won.
Yes, that's
You
awesome.
showed me, the book that you gave me during the retreat, it won for short or something. What was
Yes,
that?
the
The
boy,
horse, the mole, and
the
the
boy,
boy,
the
the horse,
horse,
the
the
mole,
mole, the fox. Is something
or
else.
something like that.
Yeah, yeah, it's such a great book. So, let's see. Jean has another question on here. Do you
Thank
think?
you, Jeannie.
Yes, she loves you. Do you think
Ah,
your parents ever regret allowing it? Do you think they understood that they were groomed at your expense? Ooh, that's a good one.
that's a great question, Jean. Thank you so much. And yes, talking with my mother, I was interviewed for the George Clooney documentary that's coming out in August about the Ohio State and Dr. Strauss situation. And they interviewed my mother on the phone. And before that, after that conversation, she told me, she said, I knew and I felt guilty and I didn't know how to tell you, or I didn't know who to go to. And so she was a victim in her own right. And she didn't know where to go to get help. And all she knew is that if she didn't follow through, bad things would happen. And she kept telling herself that boys can't be raped or boys can't be abused. So that was her only relief in the whole thing. So she really regretted it. On my father's side, it wasn't until he was passed away, right before he died, we learned that he was sexually abused through the Catholic Church as an altar boy. And so basically what he was doing was trying to protect me in his right, in his way, but at the same time, he didn't understand it. I mean, in the book, you'll read about how he drove me down a street and blamed me for all this stuff. And it was my fault that he felt that way. And it was just his way of trying to shout it out. And later on, you'll find out that he used to he would beat me because he wanted to beat it out of me. And and we never had a close relationship. It was like one of those things. I wanted him so bad to like me that it never got there. And I do believe that they both knew, because there was, when I go back and I look at things and go back, because I was journaling all through high school. And I would read about dad looking out the window at me and he knew. And then there was this weird time when the professionals really were going. This was like in the second year of it. And it became so routine that I was leaving that he almost became jealous.
Mm.
And his jealous would come out in rages. And it was really directed at me all the time because he didn't know where else to direct it. And when someone is hurting, you know,
Totally.
I don't know if they realize it, but they can hurt other people as well.
Right. Yeah, thanks for that. That's, yeah, another layer of trauma, right? That generational trauma that gets passed down. And that's what I've been really concentrating on, is trying to break that generational sin that happens, and
Mm.
so that the next generation doesn't have to go through that. I was thinking of the ways that you were vulnerable, because that's a really good way to, when I talk to kids about, identifying how you're vulnerable, so that that doesn't make you vulnerable anymore. You moved, when you were at a vulnerable age and taken out of your element. Things changed, and then you had no support, nobody. Diving, like you said, you were traveling, going around the world, and that was a new thing for you. It was, who's really there for you? You're like thrust into all of that. That must have been scary. And then here's these people, these predators that are pretending to be there to protect you. It's,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and it's confusing because I'm going to say, oh, I shouldn't say names, but many of the predators were really kind
Right.
and supportive. And like you said, it was confusing because I remember one of the doctors was always telling me, I'm so proud of you, which is what I want my dad to say to me, which he never did. And as you see, I called up after I win the gold medal, and he's like, "This is the worst joke anyone's ever pulled. My son would never win the World Games," and hung up on me. And that's a true story. And we never talked about it again until I find the article on his bedside table that he had kept, and he kept that all the way through the rest of his life. So that was the only thing I knew that he didn't. He was proud of me in his own way. But it's hard. It's hard because we don't know who to trust. We don't even trust ourselves at this point. After it's become so normalized, we're not even sure. And being bumped around a lot, it's interesting. I going back and looking at the stories, I found myself starting to question when I was in Norway with the Italian diver,
Right. Yeah.
and I misunderstood what he was doing, his unconditional love, and his just who he was, and I totally misinterpreted the whole thing. And yet he took the time to teach me many things that I would later on carry on with my life. And it was interesting that when I was in Europe, one of the things that everyone joked about is that I had never won a state or a national title. I go to Europe and I dive like the Europeans, is what they said I did. And that's how I ended up 100 points ahead of everybody in the preliminaries, because the Europeans loved me. I was invited to all these things without the rest of the Americans, because the Americans have a really bad rap as being elitist and better than everybody else. And so they would walk in and act like no one can touch them. And here's this little wide-eyed kid coming in, and everyone's just pulling me to join them. And the Russians, the Italians, the of course the Norwegians. I got to see things that other Americans didn't get to see because they would invite me. So there was all that different things, and which also brought the confusion is, why are these strangers giving me such incredible support?
Mhm.
Kind of like going into the Liberator Awards the other night. You walked into the room and all you felt was this love from all these people, and I don't know them, and they're coming up and saying hello, and like they know who I am. But it was like it's overwhelming, and yet the people that you think you need that support from are not giving it to you.
Right. Right. And that's why we journal, and that's why we need therapy, is because sometimes it doesn't matter how much love we have on the outside from the other support, but we desperately need that love from our inner circle. And
Right.
things that, yeah, make it hard. I thought it was very interesting. Not only did you write the book not in first person, but you also had it as a conversation back and forth with your therapist. And I thought that was really, really interesting. I have read a lot of survivor books, a hundreds, and I've never seen anybody do their story the way that you did. And it really kept my interest. I kept wanting to read it and find out. Sometimes there's some books where you're just like, okay, I can't take another bad thing that's happening to this
Right,
person.
right, right.
And yours was not like that, which I really appreciate. And I hope maybe some of the other people did too, notice that.
I'm glad. I'm glad. And that was what I wanted for
Yeah.
sure. And she is a real therapist, or she
Uh-huh.
was. She has retired, and she really was the first therapist I ever felt that I grew from, if that makes sense. I went through a lot of therapy situations, which really led me to feel like I was being more re-victimized than I was when it happened, because all they wanted to know was details about what happened. And I was like, but I'm more than that. I don't want to go there right now. And and her Althea, the character's name, was very, very organic. She used to call herself a hippie, and she would do all these little crazy little things, but she would like talk one thing and then change the whole conversation to get me off balance. So then she got the truth out. Because by the time I got to her, I had really figured out how to work with therapists.
Mm.
I find out what they wanted. I walk in and give them the answers that they wanted. And I was out the door because I had already realized that they were not really interested.
Yeah.
And a lot of them had no traumatic training at all.
Mhm.
And they didn't know what to do with me, you know? And so that was really, really impressive. And then when Althea was getting ready to retire, she introduced me to this other form of self-help, which is the Self-Talk Institute.
Mhm.
And once I started working with them, that's what changed my brain, because I realized that all the negative self-talk that I was telling myself was creating this false self and really hiding like an onion all the layers of who I really was. And by slowly taking those away, I start to see who I am. By going to the Self-Help Talk Institute, I changed so much that I got certified and I'm a trainer now and I can coach people, and I really love watching people grow when they realize that it's their choice to recognize and it's their choice to acknowledge that these things have happened. Not that they're responsible for it, but they take the fact that this is what happened. And I think that's one of the biggest steps for a lot of survivors, is actually admitting it happened, because
Right.
we don't want to admit, especially if it has to do with a family member or a coach or an uncle or anybody like that, because then it changes the whole dynamic of the family.
Right. Yeah, definitely. The self-talk, like, I think is a form of CBT. Um, and so I've utilized that a lot in my therapy as well. My therapist who I've had for the longest, he now has retired. He actually was a professor at the University of Dayton.
Are
Lived
you
in
kidding?
Columbus. No, lived in Columbus. I went to the University of Dayton for my master's degree in counseling, and he had an opening. I had never taken a class from him, but I knew he had a private practice in Columbus. And so I said, here's my book, read it, and then call me. And then it was wonderful because I didn't have to go through that whole intake and all the questions and everything. It's like, you read this is my intake, and then we'll start
Ah,
from that point on. But not everybody could do it.
that's fantastic.
So, Jean asked again, another great question. Has any, like when you talk to your mom about it, has she ever apologized, or have you ever talked again now later to any of the people that were a part of this, and has anybody ever apologized to you?
That's a really great question, Gene. Thank you so much. My mom, in her own way, has apologized. She's not come out and say, "I'm sorry this happened," but in her way, she has kind of like apologized. I mean, and there's times I speak to her every day during the week. We talk maybe 15 minutes before I go to boxing, and she will sometimes bring it up herself.
Mm.
And that's where I've left it. I've just said, this is off the table unless you want to talk about it. And she'll bring up things. She says, I remember this happening, and I remember how you changed and how you were very sad and you were really, you wouldn't do anything. You would lock yourself in the room and I didn't know what to do. And she says, now I understand it. I get it. And so that to me was really
Yeah.
powerful. And I hear her, I accept it, and I go with it. Most of the traffickers, unfortunately, have all passed
Mhm.
because they were much older than I was. They were, 50s and 60s when this all was happening, and so they're no longer with us. Um, I do know the coach is still alive. I did reach out to him one time, and he refused to talk to me, and so I have not been apologized or with anybody.
And it's funny how people think that's so important. And so I don't know about for you, but for me, it's not important. I don't need their apology. Like, I'm okay without that, you know?
Right, right, right. And I think sometimes we tie that in with that whole forgiveness thing.
Right,
And what
right.
does forgiveness mean to each person? And I think that forgiveness is unique for everybody.
Absolutely.
I don't think I have to do it A, B, C, and D, and then I'm forgiven, and then God's going to let me off the hook. God already let me off the hook way back then, you
Yeah,
know, and He's just letting me figure it out myself, and I appreciate that, and that gives me more rein to understand, what do I need? Do I need someone to say I'm sorry? And then what if it's not a real full
right.
a real sorry? What if it's just like, oh yeah, okay, I'll say I'm sorry because which I have seen with the U.S. gymnastics girls when they confronted Dr. Nasser on TV and everything, and he's, oh, I'm so sorry. He didn't mean it. He didn't mean it. He got caught.
Right.
That's the only thing that was matter. And I'm telling you, he totally demonstrates the predatory grooming trifecta, where he groomed the organization first, the parents second, and then the girls. He literally abused girls with the parents in the room. He was that good. and he thought he could get away with everything. And if it wasn't for people like Simone Biles and Ali Raisman, who stood up and said, hey, we were abused too, would we have gotten, would this all happen, or would it have been brushed under the rug like everything else? You know, so that's why I think that happened. I don't know. Did that answer your question, Jean?
I think
Do
so.
they think?
So we only have a few minutes left.
Oh, yes. Jean had something on there that I want to just address
Oh
really
yeah,
quickly, and I know we only have a few minutes. Jean, the guilt that I carry with myself right now that I know that they went on to abuse others is huge. Because later, after I did my whole Hollywood life and everything, I did meet a couple of boys who are still in the ring, and they were still abusing them. And I have never haven't found a way to forgive myself for that, because I could have done something, but I didn't know what to do at the time. And no one was willing to listen to a boy talk about this. And I do feel sorry for those other boys.
it definitely haunts us is the word that I use.
Yes.
And
I like that. I like that. It just, it's like a ghost kind of thing. It's like, yeah, it just sits there.
again, we need to forgive ourselves because we couldn't have done anything. We were not powerful. We had no power to do anything. And just to realize like we need to give ourselves some grace.
I
So
like that. I like giving yourself grace, opposed to, I still have a problem with forgiving that word. I don't know why.
yeah,
I think it's because I've attached to it meanings that my parents gave to me. And
did something
I
not.
want to change it. I do want to change that.
Yeah, I don't like the word forgiveness because it implies that I did something wrong, but I did,
Right.
right? And
And
I
it also applies that you
choice.
forgiven them for what they did, and that
Right.
they're no longer accountable for what they did. And that's, I think, where I get caught. Like, you're still accountable. You still did it, you know?
Yeah, exactly. That could be a whole nother hour on that conversation. I
Oh,
love
I love that. Let's
that
do it.
stuff.
Let's
I
do it.
know, right? Last question for you is, so where are you at in your life right now? Like, what are you doing? I know like I said, live in Columbus, and there's some talk about the Supreme Court going after Dr. Klaus.
Right.
But where are you at right now?
Well, my case with the Ohio State University is still pending. It's been rejected 3 times, and it's now back in because I was never a student of Ohio State University and I never graduated. I was a teenager brought onto campus and abused while on campus. And so from what I understand, I'm not the only teenager that this happened to. And Ohio State has pleaded to the Supreme Court to stop everybody suing us, because they paid out to 296 students. And they feel that they've done their due and it's not their problem anymore. And yet what's his name? The lawyers are coming up and saying, so you're saying it's okay to bring a teenager onto campus, abuse them, send them home, and do nothing about it? The abuser is protected. And that's where they're getting this whole, and they're revamping the whole Title IX and all that stuff to try to protect people. So that's where that's going. I've been on a really wonderful journey just this past year. I'm on the board of the Army Survivors, who were started by the Nassar girls, the girls abused by Nassar at U.S. Gymnast. I've gone to Capitol Hill and I've gotten to speak on behalf of abused male athletes. I've done the NCOSI for the last 3 years. They keep inviting me back and to speak and do different things. I was worked with the Child USA on their In the Game, which was about abuse of people based on what Nassar did and how to help athletes. I also was on the Olympic Committee about the athletes' rights, which helped people during the Olympics. So I've gotten to do a lot of wonderful things. And it's just incredible to be able to, one of the best things I love to do, and you're doing it right now, which it's exhausting, but talking to high schools.
Yeah.
And I did a talk right before I came to see you when we first met for the retreat. I spoke at St. John's in Toledo,
Okay.
all boys school. And to be in front of the kids who were my age when this happened to me, and to be able to talk with them and have a dialogue back was just amazing.
Yeah, it almost makes what happened to us worth it. I do believe that, I've told my kids that if God said, Teresa, you can change one thing in your life, like, doesn't matter what it is, but you had only made change one thing, I wouldn't have changed what happened to me. I
Yeah,
because of what I'm doing now. I wouldn't have been able to make this impact and, if I changed that. So, and that's a really good feeling. And I think the
yes.
same as you. You're doing so good out there, and the impact you're making, is just, it's a blessing to so many people.
And as you yourself as well, is that sometimes we don't see it. It's a lonely road.
It is.
How many times have we gone to do a speaking engagement and we're by ourselves? And someone didn't go with you, and so you find yourself there getting ready to go on the stage and you're by yourself. And then after it's over, there's that adrenaline and all that excitement and all that energy, and then you have to go back to the hotel room by yourself. It's lonely, and we don't see the ripple effect all the time.
Don't know. But God, you have to know that God is standing right next to you. He's sitting right there. The angels are with you, armies of angels, and he sees this and he's there as well. That's what comforts me, is that I know I'm really not alone. So
Right, exactly. And that's and I have my fur babies too.
yes, you do. You're lucky. Good. Well, thank you so much for
Thank
spending this
you.
hour with us. I'm sure many more people are going to get to watch this interview, and I could go on and talk to you for hours.
Oh, I could too. I could too. And please, if anybody has questions, if they want to reach them out to you, please send them to me or whatever. I'll be happy to talk to anybody. And Jean, thank you so much for all the questions. I really appreciate it.
She's actually with me, going to all of these schools with me here
Oh,
in
good. Is she
Chicago.
in the room with you?
No, she's somewhere else, but she
Oh, she-
actually is somebody that will be by my side always when I go and do stuff. So it's wonderful to have a sidekick. So yeah. And if I can ever be a sidekick for you, let me know. So
Vice
okay.
versa for you. Seriously. I love that.
Well, thank you, John Michael, for sharing your story, being vulnerable, but really teaching people, how this happens in one way to men and boys. So we really want to be inclusive and get that out there and being a part of the human trafficking narrative.
Right. And I think people will realize that once they start seeing it, they're going to see it more and more that has been hidden, especially in the sports world. It's
Absolutely.
really prevalent in there. Boy Scouts, we've seen that. The Catholic Church, unfortunately, we've seen that, but they're doing things, they're changing, there's movement going, things are improving. So the more we share, the more we talk, the more improvement there is. So, and thank everybody for supporting you and this organization and everything.
Okay, well, thank you. Have a great rest of your week.
I will, and you as well. Thank you so much. Bye, everybody.